The truth finally surfaces. Michael's shocking confession rocks Willow's trial. As Willow Tate's highly publicized trial reaches its climactic moments, a bombshell revelation promises to shake Port Charles to its core. After weeks of speculation and mounting tension, the identity of Drew's shooter is about to be exposed in open court, setting off a chain reaction that will leave no character untouched. The trial that everyone expected to convict Willow is instead becoming the stage for far more sinister truths. The burden of silent knowledge. From the moment Drew was shot outside his home on that fateful night, the mystery of who pulled the trigger has haunted Port Charles. But what the public didn't know was that at least two people held crucial information about what really happened. Michael Corinthos was there. He arrived at Drew's house with intentions to talk about Willow and their children. Instead, he stumbled upon something that would entrap him in a web of secrets and lies. For months, Michael kept quiet, while the authorities built their case against Willow. While his own alibi began to crack under scrutiny, Michael remained silent about what he truly witnessed that night. But as the trial progressed and the evidence against him mounted, the weight of that secret became impossible to bear. Tracy Quartermain had seen him parked outside Drew's residence just moments before the shooting. Anonymous letters arrived, hinting that others knew of his presence at the scene. The net was closing in, and Michael knew it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. Michael was at the scene. That much is undeniable. Alexis Davis said, steeling herself for what was about to come. As Willow's defense attorney, Alexis understood that her client's freedom might depend on exposing Michael not necessarily as the shooter, but as someone who could be made to look guilty. The jury needed doubt, and Michael provided plenty of opportunity for that. A game-changing admission. As the trial continued and pressure mounted from all sides, Alexis made her move. She called Michael back to the stand, knowing that his testimony was vital either to condemn him or, unexpectedly, to crack open the entire case. The courtroom fell silent as Michael was sworn in once more. The questioning began innocuously enough, retracing familiar ground. Yes, Michael had been at Drew's house that night. Yes, he had parked outside. But no, he did not fire the weapon that struck Drew. The DA pressed hard, suggesting that Michael's presence was proof of his guilt, that his convenient alibis and shifting story made him the perfect suspect. Michael's jaw clenched as he listened to the accusations. But Alexis had a different approach. "Mr. Corinthos," she said, her voice cutting through the tense silence, "when you arrived at Drew's residence that evening, what exactly did you see?" Michael hesitated. This was the moment of truth. For months, he had protected someone who couldn't be allowed to take the fall for what happened. Someone who had shown him nothing but cruelty and manipulation, yet someone he couldn't entirely condemn. "I saw someone," Michael finally said, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "A man. He had a gun in his hands, and he was raising it toward the door. I didn't even think. I just wanted to get away from there. Get away from the violence. I never actually saw him fire, but I heard the shots seconds after I peeled out of that driveway." "And did you recognize this man?" Alexis pressed. Michael took a deep breath. The moment had arrived. He could no longer hide, no longer protect the truth or the person behind it. "It was Jason Morgan," he said quietly. "My Uncle Jason was the one who shot Drew." The courtroom erupted. Gasps echoed from the gallery. Drew's face went pale. Willow's hand shot to her mouth. Alexis nodded as if she had expected nothing less, while the prosecution team scrambled, clearly caught off guard by this turn of events. Shock waves through Port Charles. "Michael, I have to ask, why didn't you come forward with this information immediately after the shooting?" The prosecutor demanded during cross-examination, her voice sharp with accusation. Michael shifted uncomfortably in the witness stand. "Because Jason is family. Because I needed to understand what happened before I spoke. And because I wasn't entirely sure what I saw until I had time to process it all." "You mean you were lying, perjuring yourself, to protect a family member?" The prosecutor shot back. "I wasn't lying about what I witnessed," Michael replied, his tone becoming more resolute. "I was just choosing to remain silent about it. Those are two different things." The distinction rang hollow even as he spoke it. Michael's credibility as a witness was now in serious question. His false alibi with Jacinda, his inconsistent testimony, his convenient memory of Jason as the shooter, all of it cast doubt on his reliability. The jury would have to weigh his confession against months of his previous denials and evasions. The implications rippled outward immediately. In the gallery, Carly gripped the edge of her seat, her eyes fixed on her friend Jason Morgan, who sat with a carefully neutral expression, though his hands were tightly clenched. Christina Corinthos looked devastated. Her brother had just publicly accused their uncle of attempted murder. Sonny Corinthos' face was unreadable, but his presence seemed to darken the very air around him. Jason himself remained motionless throughout the admission, neither confirming nor denying Michael's accusations. He would wait for his lawyer, for the proper channels. But in Port Charles, timing was everything, and this confession had handed both the prosecution and the defense entirely new ammunition. The uncertainty deepens. Despite the explosive nature of Michael's confession, doubts still lingered. In a trial that had become increasingly surreal, the judge and jury were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. They still weren't entirely sure what had actually happened on that night. Was Michael telling the truth about seeing Jason with the gun? Or was this another calculated move in a game of deception where everyone had lied at some point? Michael had already demonstrated a willingness to create false alibis and bend the truth to protect himself and those he loved. What would stop him from doing it again? Only this time framing Jason instead. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Judge Hannon said slowly, preparing to give his instructions, you must evaluate all testimony with a critical eye. Remember that a witness with questionable credibility on other matters may not be credible on all matters. Consider not just what is said, but the circumstances under which it is said and the motives of the person saying it. The police would need to investigate further. Evidence would need to be re-examined. Forensics would need to be reviewed in light of this new information. A rushed conclusion could be a grave mistake. Detectives Falconeri and others at the Port Charles Police Department suddenly found themselves with far more questions than answers. If Michael was telling the truth, then Jason Morgan, a known mob figure with violent tendencies, was responsible for shooting Drew Quartermain. But if Michael was lying, then Willow might still be guilty, or someone else entirely could be responsible, and a murderer could walk free. The ripple effect. Beyond the courtroom, the revelation sent shockwaves through the entire community. Families were torn apart by the implications. Willow's fate hung in unprecedented limbo. Was she finally exonerated? Or was the truth about her guilt still waiting to be uncovered? This is madness, Alexis muttered to herself after the day's session ended. She had achieved doubt, but at what cost? She had exposed Michael as a liar, which might help Willow, but she had also set off a chain reaction that could destroy families and lives. Tracy Quartermain pulled Alexis aside in a quiet corridor. Well, you got what you wanted, she said, not unkindly. But do you really believe Michael was telling the truth? Alexis met her gaze steadily. I believe he's telling the truth as he understands it. Whether that matches reality is something the police will have to determine. But now that he's said it, it's out there, and it changes everything. In the days that would follow, investigators would work frantically to piece together what actually transpired. Anonymous letters and trace evidence would take on new meaning. The ballistics, the witnesses, the timeline, and everything would need to be reassessed in light of Michael's shocking confession. A town on the edge. As Port Charles settled into an uneasy night, the city was divided. Some believed Michael's confession was proof that Jason had committed the crime and then manipulated his nephew into silence. Others were convinced that Michael was lying once again, protecting a different agenda entirely. And still others feared that the truth might be far more complicated and disturbing than anyone had yet imagined. The trial would continue. The evidence would be analyzed. The police would investigate. But one thing was certain. Willow Tate's trial had become about far more than whether she shot Drew Quartermain. It had become about the nature of truth itself in a town where secrets ran deeper than the Port Charles harbor and loyalty was often worth more than honesty. as Willow awaited the verdict, as Jason faced the possibility of arrest and prosecution, and as Michael grappled with the consequences of his confession, Port Charles was left holding its breath. We will explore an in-depth analysis of the most pivotal moments unfolding in Port Charles during the week of January 5, 2026, where secrets collide with desperation and every character's survival hangs in the balance. Laura's desperate gamble, the price of protection against Sidwell's iron fist. The tension in Port Charles reaches a boiling point this week as Mayor Laura Collins faces an impossible dilemma that will force her hand toward making choices that could fundamentally alter her moral compass. For months, the sinister Jen Sidwell has maintained an iron grip over Laura's life through his possession of incriminating photographs that link her to the death of Professor Henry Dalton, a scandal that could destroy her career, her family's reputation, and everything she has worked to build. However, the blackmail extends far beyond her personal shame. Sidwell has now turned his predatory attention toward the innocent lives under her protection, specifically her young grandson, Ace Casadini, and her beloved husband, Dr. Kevin Collins. The situation escalates dramatically when Sidwell's hired intermediary, Ezra Boyle, appears at Spoon Island with an unprecedented demand. Laura must allow a helicopter landing pad to be constructed on the estate, which would essentially grant Sidwell unfettered access to one of Port Charles' most prestigious and vulnerable locations. This isn't merely about logistics or property rights, it's about control, leverage, and the systematic dismantling of Laura's ability to protect those she loves. Sidwell has masterfully created a scenario where Laura's defiance directly endangers the people closest to her heart, a calculated psychological manipulation that would make even the most ruthless mob boss pause in admiration. What makes this week particularly harrowing is Sidwell's brazen intimidation of young Ace himself. In a chilling encounter outside of Bobby's, Sidwell approaches Charlotte Casadini and her young cousin with Marco Rios present as a witness. His words to Ace are carefully crafted, not overtly threatening, but dripping with ominous implication. The message is unmistakable. Sidwell can reach the child anywhere, at any time, and Laura's compliance is the only currency that will purchase Ace's safety. Charlotte, observing this predatory behavior directed at her young cousin, rushes to report the encounter to her grandmother, setting off alarm bells throughout the Casadini household. Panicked and facing a genuine threat to the life of an innocent child, Laura turns to Kevin with a proposal that will test the very foundation of their marriage and his principles as a psychiatrist. She desperately implores Kevin to take Ace out of Port Charles entirely, specifically to Dublin, Ireland, where Kevin has just received an offer to teach at a prestigious university. The plan, while heartbreaking for Laura, would place both Kevin and Ace beyond Sidwell's immediate reach, creating geographic and legal boundaries that the villain cannot easily penetrate. However, accepting this solution means enduring a painful separation from those she loves most, and it raises questions about whether running is truly a solution or merely postponing the inevitable confrontation with a man who has already demonstrated his willingness to pursue enemies across continents. Kevin's reluctance to abandon Laura to face Sidwell alone creates an emotional crucible for both of them. As a trained psychiatrist, Kevin understands the psychological toll of capitulating to blackmail. Yet as a father figure to Ace, he cannot ignore the existential threat hanging over the child. The decision they must make this week represents a profound moral crossroads that will echo throughout the remaining months of this dangerous game with Sidwell. The Willow trial's shocking revelations. When testimony becomes a double-edged sword, the courtroom becomes ground zero for chaos and betrayal this week as Willow Tate's trial reaches its critical juncture, with new evidence and unexpected testimony threatening to upend everything that the prosecution and defense believe they have established. Alexis Davis, Willow's defense attorney, has been working with methodical precision to cast doubt on the evidence against her client. But her strategy requires a delicate balancing act that could either liberate an innocent woman or accidentally expose her own family members as accessories to potential crimes. The linchpin of Alexis's defense strategy revolves around witness testimony, particularly from witnesses who were present that fateful night when Congressman Drew Cain was shot. Her cross-examination approach is aggressive and calculated, designed to expose inconsistencies, holes in the police investigation, and alternative theories of the crime that might explain the presence of three suspicious characters: Michael Corinthos, Willow Tate, and a mysterious third party at Drew's residence the evening of the shooting. What complicates this matter is that Alexis's defense, while intended to free Willow, could have the unintended consequence of incriminating Michael, her nephew, in a crime that he may or may not have actually committed. Christina Corinthos Davis, Michael's sister, recognizes the dangerous trajectory of her mother's legal maneuvering and takes matters into her own hands. Rather than allowing the trial to destroy her family from within, Christina conducts her own investigation into Jacinda Bracken, the crucial witness whose testimony could determine Willow's fate. Jacinda, a former sex worker who became involved with Michael under complicated circumstances, provided Michael with an alibi for that crucial night she claimed she was with him throughout the evening. However, Christina's investigation reveals disturbing inconsistencies in Jacinda's story, leading her to construct an audacious and ethically questionable plan: convince Jacinda to flee Port Charles before she is compelled to testify under oath. Christina's approach to Jacinda represents both familial loyalty and moral compromise. She approaches the other woman with what appears to be a generous offer: cash, means of transportation, and a fresh start far away from Port Charles, with no questions asked and no expectation of future contact. The temptation is almost irresistible for Jacinda, who finds herself trapped between a budding romantic relationship with Michael and the legal consequences of perjury if her fabricated alibi is exposed in court. For a brief moment, it seems possible that Christina's plan might work, that Jacinda might accept the offer and disappear into a new life with a clean slate. However, Christina's plan ultimately fails because Jacinda's presence at the trial is legally non-negotiable. A subpoena is issued, and Jacinda's absence would result in contempt of court charges and potentially a more severe investigation into her whereabouts. Forced to take the stand, Jacinda's testimony becomes a bombshell revelation that shakes the entire foundation of the case. Under intense cross-examination by both Alexis Davis and Ada Justine Turner, Jacinda's carefully constructed lies unravel completely, exposing the fact that she was not actually with Michael. On the night of the shooting, she was with Ezra Boyle, one of Sidwell's operatives, engaged in an illicit transaction that neither party was willing to admit to publicly. This revelation has cascading effects throughout the trial. Michael's credibility as a potential witness is destroyed by the exposure of his perjury. Tracy Quartermain, who had offered to corroborate Michael's false statement, watches in horror as her complicity becomes apparent to everyone in the courtroom. The real question of who actually shot Drew Cain remains tantalizingly unresolved, hanging over the trial like a specter that no amount of legal maneuvering can exorcise. Valentin's dangerous secret, a fugitive's dilemma in Carlisle's hidden sanctuary. The situation involving Valentin Casadini reaches critical mass this week as the fugitive continues his existence in an increasingly precarious hiding place within Carlisle's attic. Valentin's status as a wanted fugitive hunted simultaneously by the WSB, law enforcement, and his old enemy Jack Brennan creates a nearly impossible situation that offers no clean exit and only deteriorating options. Carly, who initially agreed to harbor Valentin as a strategic move against Brennan, finds herself drawn deeper into a complex alliance that blurs the lines between professional partnership and personal attraction. The true test of Valentin's situation comes when a surprise visitor appears at Carlisle's house, someone he was not expecting, but who is decidedly not an enemy. The footsteps on the attic stairs, the gentle creak of the door, these mundane sounds trigger recognition and a wave of complicated emotion. Charlotte Casadini, Valentin's beloved daughter, has managed to evade her police minders and made her way to Carlisle's house, guided by subtle clues and maternal intuition that told her where her father might be hiding. The reunion between father and daughter is both touching and fraught with danger. Valentin's tone when addressing Charlotte is uncharacteristically gentle, a softness that barely masks the terror he feels at his daughter's presence in this dangerous situation. He immediately questions her about how she discovered his location and why she would take such an extraordinary risk to find him. Charlotte's explanation reveals a young woman on the precipice of adulthood, struggling with the weight of family secrets and the psychological burden of knowing her father is a fugitive, but being unable to discuss this knowledge with anyone she trusts. Charlotte carries information that could alter Valentin's entire situation. She has observed Sidwell's predatory behavior toward Ace Casadini and has heard whispered conversations between adults about a larger conspiracy involving the WSB, Brennan, and various criminal organizations vying for control of Port Charles' underworld. More significantly, Charlotte has become aware of Sidwell's apparent interest in recruiting Valentin to his organization, an offer that represents both opportunity and existential threat. If Valentin refuses Sidwell, he becomes a disposable loose end. If he accepts, he becomes trapped in an even more complicated web of criminal obligation with no clear path to freedom or reunion with his daughter. Valentin and Carly recognize the necessity of developing a new strategy that acknowledges the changed circumstances. The simple act of hiding in Carly's attic becomes impossible if Sidwell becomes aware of Valentin's location. Yet going on the offensive against Brennan, while simultaneously evading Sidwell and the WSB, represents a military-level coordination that requires resources and allies they can barely muster. The two conspirators begin to formulate contingency plans, each more dangerous than the last, each with a higher likelihood of catastrophic failure. The week ends with Valentin and Carly recognizing a hard truth. They cannot simply wait for circumstances to improve. They cannot hide forever. They cannot negotiate with an enemy who views negotiation as weakness. And they cannot afford to allow either Brennan or Sidwell to maintain the upper hand. What emerges from their late-night conversation in the shadows of Carly's home is the outline of a bold, reckless plan that could either result in Valentin's liberation or his permanent disappearance from Port Charles and possibly from Charlotte's life forever. The intersection of conspiracy, when enemies become allies against a greater threat. Perhaps the most striking development of this week emerges from the unlikely alliance formed between Laura Collins and Sonny Corinthos, two individuals who have spent years on opposite sides of the law, who fundamentally disagree about morality, justice, and the proper functioning of society. Yet desperation and a common enemy have forced them into an awkward partnership that may prove to be either their salvation or their mutual destruction. Sonny, the local mob boss whose criminal empire has been systematically infiltrated and undermined by Sidwell's machinations, recognizes that he lacks the legal and political resources to combat Sidwell effectively on his own. Laura, conversely, possesses legitimate authority, political connections, and access to law enforcement resources. Yet she is hamstrung by Sidwell's blackmail and the need to maintain her reputation and position. Together, however, they might be able to construct a strategy that utilizes both the legitimate and illegitimate channels of power available to them. Sonny begins to quietly investigate Sidwell's vulnerabilities, searching for leverage that might be used to turn the tables on the blackmailer. What he discovers is that Sidwell is not as secure in his position as he appears. His relationship with Lucy Co. is complicated and potentially unstable. His partnership with Ava Jerome is built on mutual deception rather than genuine alliance, and his control over various criminal enterprises remains contested by other ambitious operators. The week ends with both Laura and Sonny recognizing that the path forward will require difficult choices, moral compromises, and a willingness to dance with danger. Neither of them fully trusts the other, yet both understand that isolation means defeat. As the pieces on the board shift and realign, Port Charles enters a new phase of chaos, one where the traditional rules no longer apply, where old enemies must become temporary allies, and where the cost of survival may prove higher than anyone anticipated. The echo of consequences. How individual choices create cascading devastation. The events of this week in Port Charles do not exist in isolation. Each decision, each revelation, each moment of weakness or strength reverberates throughout the community, creating consequences that will unfold over the remaining months of the year. Jacinda's destroyed credibility affects not just Michael's legal standing, but his personal relationship with her, transforming what appeared to be a genuine romantic connection into a relationship built on deception and manipulation. The exposure of Tracy's willingness to commit perjury undermines her standing within the Quartermaine family and complicates her relationships with her children and grandchildren. Kevin's potential departure to Dublin leaves Laura vulnerable to Sidwell's continued blackmail while simultaneously removing a stabilizing presence from the household and creating a void that cannot easily be filled. Valentin's increasingly desperate situation forces Charlotte to make choices that align her with the criminal underworld, transforming a young woman who appeared destined for a normal life into a character capable of negotiating with villains and accepting moral compromises that her mother, Lulu, would find abhorrent. Christina's intervention on behalf of her family, while well-intentioned, demonstrates a willingness to circumvent legal and ethical boundaries that suggests a darker transformation ahead. By the end of the week, the audience recognizes that the consequences of these events will reverberate throughout 2026, creating new conflicts, destroying existing relationships, and fundamentally altering the moral landscape of Port Charles. The citizens of this fictional town have collectively crossed a threshold, one from which there is no turning back, only forward into an increasingly murky and dangerous future where trust is currency, information is ammunition, and the line between hero and villain becomes progressively blurred and eventually indistinguishable.